The sky over Normandy that morning was a steel gray, the kind of sky that promised rain and whispered relentless conflict. Winds scoured the fields, tossing wild grass like restless ghosts who had seen too much and still demanded more. In the Allied headquarters at Saint-Germain-de-Varville, a sprawling network of tents, telephones, radios, maps, and exhausted officers, silence was a treasure so rare it was hoarded like gold. The only sound was the low murmur of urgent voices and the occasional crackle of a battlefield broadcast. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, stood hunched over a massive map stretched across a heavy oak table. Threads of chalk crisscrossed continents, arrows in red and blue stitched together like the stitches of a battered quilt. Eisenhower's jaw was firm, his eyes weary but sharp, his mind a country running dozens of wars at once. He was a man whose uniform pockets bulged with dispatches, intelligence reports, pleas from anxious politicians back home, and letters from soldiers' families, letters he never read. Across the table stood General Bernard Law Montgomery, Monty, to the British troops, a man whose presence was as large and unyielding as his reputation. There was something about Montgomery's posture, rigid as a soldier at attention even when relaxed, that suggested he saw the world in a rigid grid, vastly different from the fluid chaos Eisenhower had learned to navigate. Monty's face was lined with frustration. They simply must hold this position, Montgomery said, tapping a finger against a spot on the map near the town of Keene. His voice was precise, clipped, British, the sound of someone who always assumed correctness by default. "I understand your view, Bernard," Eisenhower said wearily, "but we cannot throw men into a meat grinder for land that—" But Monty didn't hear him. Or, perhaps, he simply did not want to. The British general's eyes gleamed with that stubborn certainty that had, more times than Eisenhower could count, caused arguments that stretched long into the night. "If we do not seize Keene now," Monty continued, "the Germans will only fortify. They will choke our advance. It's strategically unthinkable. It's also strategically costly," Eisenhower replied. "We've gone over this. Intelligence indicates heavy German armor and strength. Our losses are part of war," Monty said sharply. Eisenhower exhaled slowly. He could feel the tension in his shoulders stiffen. He had reached this point every week for too many weeks now, discussions turning into disputes, disputes turning into arguments. Monty was brilliant, respected, admired by his men, but unyielding. In a war that demanded flexibility, Monty demanded rigid excellence at any cost. "Bernard," Eisenhower said with a patient but firm tone he had not used before, "we are allies, but this is not your battle to dictate. I am Supreme Commander." Montgomery's jaw ticked, but his stare did not waver. "With all due respect, Ike, I speak for the ground realities. These men, our men, need decisive action." "Decisive action does not mean reckless action," Eisenhower replied. "We will do this another way." Montgomery opened his mouth, eyebrows raised, ready to argue, when Eisenhower, fed up, fatigued, and carrying the burden of tens of thousands of lives, said words no one expected. "Shut up or get out." The room went still. Montgomery blinked once, then again. His face registered disbelief, then shock. And finally, anger, but Eisenhower did not flinch. He stared back with an intensity born not of rage, but of the heavy weight of command. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Monty turned on his heel with a stiff salute and left the tent. Outside, the wind picked up, driving cold gusts through the canvas flaps and across the dusty ground. The tension inside the headquarters was palpable, a rupture in the Allied command structure that could blow wide open at any moment. Eisenhower stood still, leaning on the map table, wishing for a moment of peace, just one moment where strategy and sanity might align. He rubbed his temples and glanced at the clock. Orders to the Air Force, reinforcements for the front, coded messages from London and Washington. They all waited. He let out a long, weary breath. Montgomery stormed out into the bluster and mud, his greatcoat flapping behind him like a dark flag. He was not a man used to being silenced. Had he been back in London lecturing students or commanding reviews of troops on polished lawns, no one would have dared speak to him so directly. But here, in the chaos of battle, the stakes were different, and Eisenhower was different. Monty knew that deep down, and yet the sting of those words cut nonetheless. Aides hurried to his side. "Sir," one said quietly, "General Eisenhower." "Damn Eisenhower," Monty muttered. "He will rue this day." The aide blinked, taken aback. "But, sir, I'll write my own dispatch," Monty announced. "And I will go see Field Marshal Montgomery. He will understand." The aide hesitated. "Sir, did you want to inform the headquarters?" "No." Monty paused, jaw tightening. "Not yet. Not until I've spoken to someone who comprehends true strategy." And with that, he stalked off toward his own command truck, leaving the aide scrambling to keep up. Inside Eisenhower's tent, the senior staff exchanged nervous glances. Eisenhower's tone was rarely sharp. His reputation was one of measured leadership, diplomacy, and careful judgment. That he had snapped, it was significant. One of his aides, Colonel Foster, ventured a cautious question. "Sir, was that necessary? Eisenhower didn't turn from the map." He took a moment before answering, a long moment where his eyes traced lines of battlefield frontiers, past and future, and weighed the lives of soldiers he would never know personally, but was responsible for nonetheless. "Yes," Eisenhower finally said softly, "it was necessary." Colonel Foster blinked. "Sir, it was necessary," Eisenhower repeated, "because leadership sometimes means telling a man, even a great general, that brilliance accomplishes nothing without cooperation." "But Monty—" "Bernard is valuable," Eisenhower said, "but stubbornness alone won't win this war. Our strategy must be unified." A heavy silence settled over the tent. And then another messenger arrived with fresh orders from the French resistance intelligence on German movements, and Eisenhower bent over the map once more, his mind already running several steps ahead. Montgomery's truck rumbled through muddy terrain toward his temporary command post. Rain drizzled, turning roads to rivers of brown slush. Existential frustration gnawed at him. He had never been so dismissed, so clearly contradicted by a superior. Not in the deserts of North Africa, not in the brutal maneuvering of El Alamein, not ever, and yet here he was, outranked if not in ability, in position. He found himself replaying Eisenhower's words, asterisk shut up or get out, asterisk it was crude, uncharacteristic. Sharp, too sharp, but was it wrong? Monty stopped the truck abruptly and stared at the rain-darkened horizon. Then, leaning back in his seat, he made a decision, not to leave, not to escalate, but to rethink. For a man so certain of his own genius, admitting that he might be wrong was, perhaps, the harder battle he would face in this war. Slowly, he climbed out of the truck and walked through the rain toward his staff headquarters, the mud sucking at his boots, as if the ground itself tried to restrain him from thinking further. Inside, officers turned to look. Monty set his bag down with a resolute sigh. "Change of plans," he announced. Head swiveled, Montgomery looked at each of them with a focused intensity that had nothing to do with bluster and everything to do with conviction. "We adjust our strategy," he said, "based on Eisenhower's concerns. We will fortify defensively and await coordinated orders." There was a collective intake of breath, shock and relief mingled. A young aide leaned forward and said, "Sir, this aligns with headquarters directive." Montgomery nodded. Yes, we will execute it gracefully, and just like that, the storm of personal conflict began to clear. Back at Allied headquarters, Eisenhower was briefed on the change in plans. Relief coursed through him. The tension that had been wound so tight it chafed beneath his skin finally eased. Colonel Foster looked at him with admiration. Sir Monty agreed to revise his plans. Eisenhower closed his eyes for an exhausted moment. Good, he said quietly. We move forward together. And then, as though a dam of words had broken, Eisenhower whispered something almost to himself. War is not won by brilliance alone. It's won by unity under fire. The next few days were brutally decisive. Allied forces coordinated infantry, armor, and air support more seamlessly than in any previous engagement. The battles around Keene, fierce, grinding, hell-fired, nonetheless began to turn in favor of the Allies. And though the cost was terrible, the pattern of victory emerged like dawn over a ravaged landscape. Part of the success was strategic. Better supply lines, more integrated communication, more precise use of air reconnaissance. But part of it, Eisenhower would later reflect, was far more personal. It was the moment when two commanding minds, very different in temperament, had collided, argued, and found a way to reconcile personal pride with collective purpose. One afternoon, Monty arrived at headquarters to deliver a formal update. He walked into Eisenhower's tent, paused at the flap, and then stepped inside. Eisenhower looked up from the map. There was a long moment where neither man spoke, and then Monty said simply, "I want to apologize." Eisenhower blinked in surprise. Apologies were rare among generals, rarer still between allies with distinct national pride. But Monty's voice was sincere. "Not for my strategy," he clarified, "but for my obstinacy. You were right to insist on coordination." Eisenhower didn't rise. He simply studied Monty with that same sharp and thoughtful gaze. "I appreciate that," he said, "and your brilliance on the ground has saved countless lives." Montgomery nodded, the tension in his shoulders finally loosening. Then Eisenhower leaned back slightly and grinned a rare, disarming smile. "So," he said, "no more telling me how to run my command." Monty hesitated. Then, with a half-smile of his own, he said, "I shall attempt silence, sir, but I cannot guarantee complete success. After all, it's habit." Eisenhower laughed, a genuine, resonant laugh. And the tension between them that had threatened to boil over now became the source of something stronger, a mutual respect tempered by honesty and humility. The war dragged on, cities fell, lives were lost, armies advanced and retreated, surged and stalled. But the alliance that held the greatest hope for victory was not just an alliance of armies, navies, and air forces. It was an alliance of very human leaders, imperfect but resolute. And on that day, when Eisenhower finally told Montgomery to shut up or get out, history did not record it as a petty quarrel, but as a triumph of leadership, the moment two commanders found a way to transcend pride for a greater cause. No one ever accused war of being tidy, but in the end, it was not brute force alone that tipped the scales. It was understanding, respect, and the willingness to listen, even in the heart of battle.